The Watson family had a unique tradition. Every Thanksgiving morning, they gathered at an old cemetery on the edge of town to pay their respects to family members long since passed. They'd clean the graves, place fresh flowers, and share memories. The tradition had been passed down for generations, seen as an act of gratitude to those who had paved the way. But this year was different. The family had a new addition, Carter, a cousin from the city who had moved in with his aunt and uncle temporarily. Carter was known for his rebellious streak and didn't care much for traditions, especially ones he didn't understand. When Thanksgiving morning came, Carter stood off to the side, watching as the family solemnly laid flowers on the graves. He rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, "Can we eat yet?" He whispered to his cousin Rachel, who shot him a stern look. "Show some respect," she hissed, glancing nervously toward her parents. Carter scoffed. "Respect? For a bunch of rocks? Come on, it's not like they know we're here." Rachel's face paled. "Don't say things like that. They'll hear you." "Oh, please," Carter chuckled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They're dead, Rachel. Dead people can't hear. This whole ritual is just a waste of time." The family glanced his way, some frowning, others exchanging uneasy looks, but no one responded. Carter didn't seem to notice or care. He continued to joke around, even making a mock toast to the dearly departed at the graveside. That night, the family gathered around the dining room table, ready to enjoy the Thanksgiving feast. Laughter and conversation filled the air as they shared stories, toasted each other, and began to dig into their meal. But as dessert was served, something strange happened. It started with a flicker of the lights, followed by a faint chill that settled over the room. The candles on the table flickered, their flames twisting in the strange draft. The room fell quiet as the family glanced around, unsettled by the sudden change. "Did someone leave a window open?" asked Carter's aunt, shivering and glancing over her shoulder. "No," said his uncle, glancing around. "All the windows are closed." Just then the family heard a soft, rustling sound, like dry leaves scraping across the floor. It seemed to come from the far end of the table, where Carter sat. Everyone turned to look, and for a moment they thought they saw shadows, wisps of darkness in the shape of people. "Did you see that?" whispered Rachel, clutching her mother's arm. The family watched in stunned silence as the shadows slowly grew more defined, forming the shapes of figures seated at the empty chairs around the table. Slowly they began to see faces faint, ghostly, and unmistakably familiar. They were the faces of ancestors, relatives who had been gone for decades, some for centuries. Carter's smirk faded. He swallowed, his eyes darting from face to face as the figures glared back at him, their expressions cold and accusing. "This isn't funny," he stammered, trying to laugh but failing as the ghostly figures leaned closer. He could almost feel their gaze piercing through him, like icy needles pricking his skin. One of the apparitions, a man with hollow eyes and a grim frown, leaned forward. His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Respect for those who came before," he said, his voice hollow and echoing. Carter's face turned pale. He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean it. It was just a joke." The figures didn't waver. One by one, they began to reach across the table toward Carter. Their hands, thin and skeletal, stretched out, and as they reached for him, Carter felt an unbearable cold seep into his skin. Panicked, he tried to pull away, but he couldn't move. It was as if an invisible force held him in place, forcing him to face the consequences of his disrespect. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." The spirits remained silent, their faces solemn and unforgiving. Then, slowly, one of them leaned close, mere inches from Carter's face. It was an elderly woman with sorrowful eyes, her face etched with pain and disappointment. "Honor the dead," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Or join us." At those words, Carter's heart nearly stopped. He felt his body go cold, his limbs stiffen, as if he were being pulled from this world into theirs. Just as he thought he would pass out, the spirits began to fade, dissolving into wisps of smoke. The room fell silent once more, leaving the family sitting in stunned, horrified silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Carter sat frozen in his chair, his hands trembling, his face as pale as a ghost. Finally, he looked around at his family, his voice a hoarse whisper. I'm sorry. I didn't know." No one spoke. The rest of the meal was eaten in silence, and when the family left the table that night, the air was heavy with something unspoken. The following Thanksgiving, Carter was the first to volunteer to visit the cemetery. He laid flowers at each grave, bowing his head in quiet respect, his heart pounding as he whispered a simple, heartfelt apology. From that day on, he never missed a chance to honor his, and each year, as he placed flowers on their graves, he felt their eyes watching him, not with anger, but with something that almost felt like forgiveness. And so the Watson family's tradition continued, but no one ever forgot the night the dead returned to claim their place at the table.